Great, thanks. Can you see my main presentation up there, Raleigh?
Yes, I can see it beautifully.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Well, thanks everyone for having me in this plenary discussion. And Scott did a really great job of giving an overview of the different goals and outcomes that we have at the Chesapeake Bay program from the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, and also went into some of the science and research questions that are associated with the breadth of those goals. And so I was really heartened to see on our first Menti question there, that the attendees of this conference also really represent the breadth of those goals, which is good, because I think that you'll be really interested in a lot of the science and research questions that we're also interested in. So my presentation is going to talk about how you can engage with the Chesapeake Bay program on some of those science and research questions. And so the title of my talk is Plugging into Chesapeake Bay Program Science. I fully admit it was a shameless attempt at a pun based on the virtual nature of the conference. But because of the virtual nature of the conference, I can't tell if anyone's laughing. So I'll just hope that there were a few chuckles out there. So what I'm going to talk about are, I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail on some of the science and research questions that we're interested in, and then get into the spectrum of opportunities that you have to engage with the Chesapeake Bay program. But the first thing I want to talk about is the why. Why engage with the Bay program in the first place? And so the first reason is because the Bay program is really focused on using science-based decision-making. It's right there in the front of our slogan, right at the very beginning. And so we really want to bring in the best available science to help guide us. And so there's absolutely a seat for you at the table. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of why engage with the Bay program is that I really do think that it's mutually beneficial. And so we are not just looking for scientists and researchers like yourself to do science and hand it to us. We are really much more interested in a two-way street and working with you throughout the process, the scientific process, and engaging with you throughout. And I think that there are many things that the Bay program brings to the table that you might find beneficial as well. And so I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking through some of those things. And so on the left here, science providers like yourself bring a lot of things to the table. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is simply what I could fit in a legible font in a Venn diagram. But you obviously, as scientists and researchers, bring your subject matter expertise. And that's something that we really need. We don't necessarily have that within the Bay program. And so we need you to bring that in. You're also doing the cutting edge research and analysis that we want to use in our decision making and that we want to integrate into our program. You all do the data collection and field work and monitoring. And so you're out there and seeing and understanding what's happening in the watershed on the ground, in our rivers and streams, and in our tidal waters. And then you, of course, can provide guidance and direction. We at the Bay program want to make sure that our goals are appropriate and that we are using the science in the right way. And so that is something that we look to you as scientific experts to help us with. But like I said, I also think that the Bay program brings some things to the table that you as scientists and researchers might find beneficial. So we have subject matter expertise within the Bay program staff as well. This conference is a testament to that. There were a number of Bay program staff that have given presentations on their analytical work. And so there's absolutely an opportunity to collaborate with us in that way. But I also think a lot of the other things that we bring to the table are things that help your research be more relevant, especially to maybe a management or decision-making context and community. So if you didn't notice, the second word in our slogan for the Chesapeake Bay program was policy. And so by the very nature of the Chesapeake Bay program, we have access to management, managers and decision makers that can help frame management relevant research questions. We also have a lot of different mature channels for stakeholder engagement, and not just with federal and state agencies, but with local communities, with conservation districts or planning district commissions, with citizen scientists. And so you have access to all of those different stakeholder engagement channels that we use on a regular basis. And then along with those stakeholder channels comes the ability to do audience and user research. And so I think this is really important because it allows you to work with and engage the end users of your science from the very beginning of the process and make sure that whatever products you're producing at the end of the day, on top of, say, research papers, are going to be things that can be used by the community that's looking to use your science. And so I think when all of these things come together, what we get is co-produced actionable science. I know that co-production and actionable are both big buzzwords in the scientific community right now, but I really do think that we're set up with the perfect model to carry this out. On the co-production side, you as scientists and researchers have access to managers to help frame your questions from the beginning together and guide projects. But what that also means is that at the end of the day, you already have an audience that is ready, willing, and able to use your science in actionable ways. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes going over this why. If you don't remember anything else in this talk, remember this: there are mutually beneficial reasons to collaborate together between science providers like yourself and the Chesapeake Bay program. So now what I'm going to talk about briefly are a bit more detail on some of the science and research questions that we're interested in. So Scott gave a really great overview of our different goals. These are the actual 10 goals of the watershed agreement laid out again. And Scott also gave an introduction to the strategic science and research framework, which is basically a new process that we developed at the Bay program over the last year and a half that we are using as our way of tracking and assessing our science needs across the program on a more consistent and ongoing basis. And one of the things that this results in is basically a master science needs list across the program. I'm excited to say that we are trying to make this available online very soon in a searchable and filterable, publicly accessible format. But we've already been using it to engage some of our science providers around some of these questions that we're interested in. What I want to point out to you is that our master science needs list obviously covers the breadth of topic areas that our goals are related to, but it also runs the gamut in terms of the types of science and research questions that we have, the types of resources necessary to carry them out, the timelines on which we would expect them to be carried out. And so I really do think that there's something for everyone on this list in terms of matching with what you're interested in. So we have needs for developing models and modeling techniques and methods. We have needs for long-term monitoring. We have fundamental research needs for understanding some basics of our systems. That could be 2 to 5 to 10-year research projects or questions. But we also have some of those shorter data analysis needs where we need a project done, say in a year, we have all the data available, we need someone with the expertise to do the analysis. And so there's really different types of needs that we have as a program. And what I want to make sure is that you don't think that we're only interested in kind of short turnaround, quick, less than 6-month science questions. We're really interested in all these different types of questions that we have. And I will make a plug that if you're looking for projects for grad students, this list is a great place to go. I imagine there's a lot of different projects on here that could be great and appropriate for a master's or PhD student. So just wanted to throw in that plug. So what I'll do is just go into a few examples of some of the needs that are on this list that are related to those challenges that Scott laid out in his presentation coming from the different goals that we have. And this by no means covers all of our needs or all of our interests. And so if you don't see yourself in the next couple slides in terms of what you're interested in, don't be disheartened. It doesn't mean that we don't have research questions that we're interested in. It just means that I could only pick 3 to go over. So the first one I'll talk about is what Scott mentioned in connecting water quality to living resources. So the Bay program has traditionally been very focused on water quality, and now especially with the implementation of the watershed agreement, we're really interested in understanding how improving water quality is going to impact our living resources. And so there's a couple specific needs that I've listed here just as purely as examples that are straight out of our science needs list, so you can see some of the things that we're interested in. One is to maintain a telemetry network to monitor fish abundance and distribution in the tidal waters, so that we can start connecting when we do bring back dissolved oxygen, when we do bring back the water quality, are we seeing the fish respond in the way that we would expect? If you build it, will they come? The second listed here is monitoring the vertical water column habitat for hypoxia. So looking at spatial distribution of hypoxia within the water column and connecting that to habitat suitability for our living resources and fish populations. So those are some examples of specific needs within that overarching topic of connecting water quality to living resources. The next one I'll go over briefly is connecting living resources to habitat. So Scott mentioned our need to start looking at some of these habitat factors. So This is just a great diagram that I found that shows that water quality is just one of many aspects that go into habitat and go into determining if an area is suitable for living resources to populate. And so two of the needs that we have on our list are to pilot a regional fish habitat assessment. This is obviously a much larger project encompassed in that one bullet with a lot of different steps, but we're looking to do it with partners like NOAA in the tidal waters and with the USGS up in the watershed. And the second one is to identify non-biological factors influencing biological stream health up in the watershed. So from a stream health perspective in our freshwater rivers and streams, we're looking to identify what other factors are influencing whether or not we can bring our communities back in those streams. The third example I'll go over is climate change impacts on living resources. So climate change in general is something that we're obviously very interested in across the program. And we have a lot of different science and research questions associated with climate change. For example, how BMP efficiencies and effectiveness might change in response to a changing climate. What I'm focusing on here are just impacts to living resources as one example. So the first one, assess impact of climate change on fish distribution. A lot of us are familiar with the idea of the habitat squeeze, where warm waters and low oxygen waters are going to reduce the amount of habitat available for fish in our tidal waters. And so looking at what those effects are going to be is something that we're interested in, as well as assessing the impacts of climate change on, for example, freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation species. So how are those species going to respond to the changing conditions in the bay, warming waters, potentially different salinity regimes? And so we're interested in that and how it's going to impact our submerged aquatic vegetation goals. And I will say one thing I did was I looked at the sessions at this conference and tried to bring some of these needs forward that were potentially of interest based on what those sessions were focused on. And the last one I'll mention also relates to what Scott was talking about with stewardship and the challenge of incorporating social science. So I know that when we say social science, it's like saying physical science. There are a ton of disciplines underneath there, and it's a huge umbrella. But that's exactly one of the things that we're interested in, is understanding which disciplines of social science are most relevant for us to pull into the Bay program for our goals, and how can we strategize engaging with those scientific communities to do that in the best way possible. So two of our needs are to identify some methods for incorporating social science into the Bay program in general. And then more specifically, another example of a need we have is to specifically look at ecosystem services. We want to identify, quantify, and value ecosystem services associated with our goals and outcomes. So those are some examples of the specific needs that are on our list related to some of these higher level challenges coming out of our goals and outcomes across the program and the watershed agreement. Now what I want to shift into is talking about engaging with you all and you all engaging with us as the Bay program. And so Scott brought up this kind of diagram of the way that science support works within the Bay program. At the top there, you can see what we have our goal implementation teams. And these are basically our teams within the Bay program that are made up of members all across different sectors, state, federal agencies, local communities, nonprofits, academic institutions. But these groups are really the ones that are making the day-to-day progress on the work towards our goals. But they don't only focus on science. They have to focus on the policy questions and the communication issues and all of those other things. And so at the bottom, you'll see we really rely on science providers like yourself across all different organizations and institutions to help us bring that science into the program. And then Scott mentioned STAC and STAR, STAC being our external advisory committee and STAR being our internal science coordinating body. Those two groups really work to try and be the matchmakers between our goal implementation teams within the program and science providers outside of the program. So what I'm going to do is walk through just a few examples of how we're currently engaging with some of these different types of science providers. But what I want to do while I'm doing that is bring up another Menti question. And I'll pull it up right here. So if you go back to the same Menti website that you were using before, the code is the same and everything. I want to get some of your thoughts on what some barriers are for you engaging with the Chesapeake Bay program. These could be anything like time commitment, or you don't know who to contact, or you're not sure if you're interested in the material. And so what I would say is just take a few minutes, put in a few sentences or a few words. I'm actually just going to walk through the next couple of slides here while we're doing that, and then we'll go and take a look back at some of the answers that we get. I'll just pull that to the side, make sure that it's open for people to type in. Great. So like I said, I'm just going to walk through a few examples of how we've been engaging with some of these different entities outside of the Bay program. So the first example is interacting with our federal agency research partners. And a great example of this is USGS. So as Scott, I believe, mentioned, over the last several years, the USGS has really evolved its Chesapeake Bay program, or its Chesapeake Bay region science program, to address a lot of the needs of the Chesapeake Bay program. And so just two examples of where we're coordinating with them are on stream health and healthy watersheds. Kelly Maloney of USGS Leetown Science Center works very closely with our stream health work group because he does work on modeling stream health conditions in between places where we monitor. And so that's incredibly helpful for us as we look at developing our stream health indicator. Another example on the right is Renee Thompson, who's with USGS at the Chesapeake Bay program. And she works very closely with the Healthy Watersheds Goal Implementation Team and is very involved in that, and has been working over the last several years with a contractor to develop the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds Assessment, which Scott mentioned in his presentation. And so this is just showing you one example of the vulnerability metrics from that Healthy Watersheds Assessment. And so she's working very closely with that group at the Bay program to understand metrics that we can use to identify healthy watersheds, track change over time, and identify vulnerable watersheds. And I believe she gave a presentation at the conference on this work. The second example is looking at nonprofit partners and citizen science. So we have the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which is a cooperative of citizen science and citizen monitoring organizations within the Chesapeake Bay region. The monitoring cooperative is administered by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, but there are a lot of different nonprofits like the Isaac Walton League that are part of the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative. And we have been engaging with them and basically created a partnership where they are going to be doing citizen sampling for benthic macroinvertebrates in streams around the region where we don't currently have monitoring for our stream health indicator. And as part of this partnership, we've pulled in EPA Region 3, who's actually going to be processing those samples. And that way we'll have samples that are at a high enough quality to actually use in our stream health indicator. So this is really exciting because we're using these citizen scientists as science providers to help us improve and increase our monitoring coverage. And the final example I'll give is engaging with academic and research institutions. And specifically, I'm talking about an example with the Submerged Aquatic Vegetation Synthesis Team, which was a group of scientists across different organizations, including VIMS, UMCES, Maryland DNR, and a number of different organizations. And over the past several years, worked on looking at explaining changes in SAV in the tidal waters over time. And so I think this is really a great example of that co-production model because we had managers, folks from the management community involved in this from the very beginning to help frame some of the research questions for this synthesis, but then also to help frame the types of products that would be most useful for managers at the end of the day. And so while the researchers got some really great papers out of it, including a high impact PNAS paper, the management community also got some products that were relevant and accessible to them in terms of these fact sheets, which we were able to put on an online platform. And so it really allowed the scientists and the managers to come together from the beginning and act on the science at the end of the day. So next thing I'm going to talk about is the actual spectrum of ways that you can engage with the Chesapeake Bay program. But I want to see if we have any responses to our poll here first, because hopefully what I'll be able to do is address some of the barriers that you're identifying. So I'll just read to you a couple of them here. We're not going to go through all of them, but we are capturing all of them, and I'm going to leave this open for the rest of the time this morning so that we can use this as the Bay program to understand ways that we can better engage with you. So here are some great ones. Was not aware of opportunities or how to engage. Perfect. The next slide is for you. Who to contact or how to get involved. That's a great question too. So for the moment, who to contact, I would be a great person to contact to put you in contact with the right group that you're interested in working with Denise Wardrop or Gary Schenk. I didn't ask them, but I'm pretty sure they would be okay with you contacting them as well. So those are just some examples. A cumbersome website to find information I need. Great point. Not at one of the big universities or labs. Unfamiliar with how the Bay program is organized and who to approach with science questions. So these are all really, really great barriers that I'm glad you're identifying. I think my last two slides are going to help you understand some of the ways to overcome those barriers, but we're really going to use this to understand ways that we as the Chesapeake Bay program can do a better job of reaching out to you and understanding what sort of obstacles exist for you engaging with us. So thank you for your answers on that. I'm going to leave it open, so please feel free to continue to answer. So what I'm going to end with is the punchline of the spectrum of opportunities that you have available to you for engaging with the Chesapeake Bay program. And one thing, I put a spectrum here of what I would consider kind of less time commitment to more time commitment. You might think things are in a different place than I put them, which is totally fine. I think the point at the end of the day is that anything along this spectrum is beneficial, and we would be more than happy to engage with you in any way that you have time for, or any way that works with what you're interested in. But I'm just going to walk through a few examples to give you some ideas. So maybe on the more time commitment side of the spectrum, we have the opportunity to actively participate in Chesapeake Bay teams or work groups. So some examples of this would be Raleigh Hood, for example, is involved in the modeling work group. And so that might involve calling into the meetings, doing a little bit of review or things like that in between the meetings. Another example of that could be participating on STAC, on the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee as a member. It could also involve actually being a member of one of our work groups or action teams. For example, if you actually want to participate in those meetings, in one of those teams that does the sort of day-to-day carrying out of our progress. Now, that might not be your cup of tea, that might be too much of a time commitment, and in fact, what we've heard from a lot of scientists and researchers is that those normal meetings, because they don't only focus on science and they focus on all of those other questions like policy and communication, are maybe not as of much interest and are too much of a time commitment. And so there's also something else that you can do, which is engage on specific research questions with these teams. And so there's a number of really great examples of people doing this. I think some good ones are Marjorie Friedrichs, for example, I think works with a number of different people at the Bay program, like Gary Schenk, for example, on hypoxia modeling and forecasting and the things that we're interested in on that side of things. Jeremy Testa, for example, has been involved in water quality synthesis recently, as well as the synthesis he's working on right now. And so those are specific research questions that they're interested in, that we're interested in. And so we can put you in touch with the right groups to focus on that work. Another great example is EPA Region 3's Field Services Branch has been interacting with the Brook Trout Action Team on eDNA, helping with method development and providing webinars and trainings. And so that's another example of engaging on something specific. And then finally, you can also just participate in workshops or events that are more one-off events. Staff workshops are a great way to be able to provide your expertise and have your expertise captured. And even within staff workshops, there's a spectrum of, you could simply be a participant, you could be involved in the steering committee for planning a workshop, or you could submit an application for a workshop and help lead it. And so these are hopefully just a taste of the different ways that you can be involved. What I've hopefully done is shown you that there really is a spectrum, that there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved based on your schedule and what your interests are. And so I just want to finish with those same things I said at the beginning. Obviously, it's beneficial to us to have you as science providers and to collaborate and engage with you. But I do think for you, there are some benefits as well. You have access to our great management community to help frame some of your research questions. We have our different communication channels with stakeholders that you can access. We obviously have scientific expertise, but we also have communication expertise, which I think is really important. We have a great communications work group and communications team for understanding who our end audiences are and what types of products they're interested in. And then Scott mentioned this at the end of his talk. We've also seen that when scientists engage with our work groups are able to provide letters of support to them during funding applications or things like that. And so I want to encourage you to think about some of these different ways to interact with us. Like I said, there's a really big spectrum. So that's all I have to say on engaging and plugging into the Chesapeake Bay program. Before I take questions, I do just want to say one thing. In light of all of the things that have been going on around our country over the last several weeks. I think Dr. Irby alluded to this during his presentation yesterday, that in the field of environmental science and really all of its disciplines, people of color are drastically underrepresented. And so I think the last few weeks have shown me that we still have a lot of work to do to continue to fight inequity and injustice and inequality across every corner of our society, and our field of work is no exception. And so I think that this is an opportunity for us to demand more of ourselves and also of our institutions, whether they be academic or government, public or private. And I think that we really each have a role and a responsibility that we can play in ensuring that people of color and that people, other representatives of underrepresented communities are recruited and supported and retained and heard in our discipline and in our institutions. I don't think that we need to wait for someone else to change things, and we don't need to wait for our superiors to tell us that we have to change things. I think we as a scientific community together have the power to do that. And so I encourage everyone, very much myself included, to seize the opportunity to do just that. So thanks very much, and thanks again. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to chat with you all today, and happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Emily, for that great presentation and those important thoughts at the end regarding the need for more diversity. We have just a couple minutes for some questions, and so I have another question here from Don Bosch. He says, Emily, don't curb your enthusiasm. While the Bay Agreement includes climate change impacts and adaptation, since this commitment was made, most Bay states, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, have made major commitments to climate change mitigation, i.e. toward eliminating their greenhouse gas emissions. How might this change Bay program approaches and science needs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great point that a lot of our state partners have made those commitments to reducing emissions and also adapting to climate change as well. And so I think one of the things that we're interested in is understanding not only the impacts of climate change, but the impacts of some of those policies. And so how are some of those, whether it's emissions reduction policies, going to change things, or how some of those adaptation policies are going to influence things on the ground. I think we're interested in, from the scientific perspective, in understanding those collective impacts.
Okay, and we have just another minute maybe for one more quick question, if there's any other questions from the audience. And if not, I'll just thank Emily and Scott again for that lovely tag team presentation. I think you guys just really did a nice job of communicating the science needs and how people can get involved.